It is now my great pleasure to welcome to the stage the Director-General of the Department of Education, Sharyn O'Neill. Sharyn is a regular attender of our conferences and also comes to State Council, and we have the opportunity to meet with her or representatives through the year. So I would ask conference to please welcome Sharyn. Thank you.
Thanks, Kylie. Good morning to everyone. It's certainly great once again to have the opportunity to come and share some thoughts with you, and later I think answer some questions. Just before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where your meeting's being held yesterday and today, and also to acknowledge your President, Kylie Catto, who is a tremendous supporter of public schooling, both personally and in her role here with WACSSO. Also to her executive for their partnership with our schools. So thank you for that. The first half of 2015 has been a very good one for public schools around the state. We had the introduction of the Year 7 children into secondary settings, and for the most part that's been pretty seamless. As I go around to schools, and I visit a lot of them, and talk to the Year 7 students, among others, they tell me pretty much they feel like they've always been there now. They're pretty much settled in. Perhaps it's just the parents and the teachers who are having the struggle. Parents, some parents were reasonably anxious at the start of the year, as probably were some teachers as they got on top of the curriculum that was set out for Year 7s in secondary. But that's been a fantastic implementation thus far, and of course it hasn't finished because we need to make sure that momentum is maintained. And the Office of the Auditor-General made some very good comments, very positive comments, which isn't always the case, about that implementation. We've also had the new funding model, and that's had its moments. But from where I stand as Director-General now for 9 years and Deputy for 3 years before that, and as a person in the system for a long time, given we've suffered pretty much a broken and unfair system, and I didn't realise how unfair some of it was until we dug right deeply into it, for more than 20 years, I'm, as Director-General, very willing to bear a few teething problems, and some of you may have questions later about that. Because I just can't imagine anyone in this room that would want to go on supporting a model from yesteryear that so blatantly disadvantaged some schools over others with very little explanation. In fact, some schools were receiving nearly $750,000 more than another school that had the same sorts of students, the same numbers of students. Am I going too quickly? I just get a bit wound up. Had the same age, of buildings, the same kinds of programs, and it was a historical build-up over time of different arrangements. And personally, I just find that hard to agree with sustaining a model where we know that some were advantaged over others for no good reason, although I'm sure they enjoyed it at the time. I think it's good to remind ourselves that, and perhaps the Minister mentioned, since about 2008 there's been a vast increase in the state budget to education, but there's also been a big increase in the cost of schooling around the state. And while, I'm pleased to be Director-General and have received those funds, we will always argue for more because the job is never done. Everyone's needs, need to be met in very different ways in different schools, and so that's just an ongoing piece of work that we all must commit ourselves to. 2015 has also seen the beginning of the formal implementation of the new Australian curriculum, and you might have already seen in the press, talks about refinements already. Curriculum is dynamic as we learn and grow, I guess, as education systems. And it has been the ground for much debate and for some much consternation. We've also had the implementation of the new standards in the early years, an agreement across Australia about the best way to implement early years education, including in other states education in other settings. Western Australia is one, I think the only state where, for example, 4-year-olds do their kindergarten years or learning in schools. Most other states, not all, most other states, for example New South Wales, you do that in a private setting outside of the school. And so Western Australia certainly has led the way in that, and we're participating in those standards. And that's on the back of some pretty solid NAPLAN results, but also some areas that need some real improvement. And writing is one of those ones where we're going to have to give more focus. And then back to December and January, which seems like a long time ago, outstanding waste results for public schools. And of course, around all of that, 442 public schools now working with greater autonomy alongside their community as part of IPS. So that there's been a lot of reform, a lot of change, a lot of hard work, a lot of good results alongside that, and certainly some areas that need to be sharpened up. So a lot to be proud of, and I reckon a lot to be confident in too. And that's why for the 3rd year in a row we've increased market share, what we call market share, the proportion of people coming into the public system and the proportion of people going to private education. So it hadn't been the case for 20 years consecutively, but now 3 years in a row, strengthening market share. And I'm the first person to say, some of that's to do with economics, obviously. But not all, and as I go around into communities, both public and private, the confidence that is being re-established in public schools is quite a tribute to our schools and your support of them. So my key focus of some comments today really is that given all of that wonderful reform and the pain that always goes with reform, a bit of pain, we can't rest on our laurels. We can't be so pleased with ourselves that we forget there is so much more to do. And my thoughts for today really around the topic about our partnership in that, and our partnership must start early. Most children are fortunate enough to have in their lives 2 main educators. Their parents or caregivers, because sometimes it's not their parents, and their teachers. You as parents, or the key caregivers, sometimes it's grandparents, are the prime educators in a child's life until they attend one of our early years programs. But make no mistake, you remain the most significant education influence in your child's life. Sometimes you don't feel like it. I know as a parent I didn't feel like it when my son kept arguing with me about topics of curriculum because his teacher said it was this and I said it was that. And he said, "What would you know?" And that's how it is sometimes, isn't it? Like the parent, feels like you take a back seat because the teacher said so. If only they kind of, when they were teenagers, listened to the teacher said so. But you remain the most significant education influence in your child's life. And that involvement can take many forms, but the main 2 are these. The first, parental involvement in the general life of the school. And the second, your involvement in the support of a child's learning in the home. Interesting research a few years ago showed that most parents felt fairly involved in their child's school. What I thought was really interesting was around half felt very involved in a child's school. Now, I don't know how that looks from where you sit as a P&C. I know how it looks from where I sit, talking to councils. I would love to think we had half of our parents very involved in their child's education. And I was really very interested about the studies that suggest the father's involvement has increased significantly since the 1970s, particularly with children under the age of 5. Unfortunately, there's also a large number of fathers that recorded in that study, in a couple of studies, no daily direct contact with their children or any interaction time with their children, let alone in relation to their learning. And this reflects, I think, large part, the changing structure of families. Of interest is that fathers who wanted to be involved and were involved indicated that their preference was to help out with things like IT, with the computers, with building things, and were much less inclined to want to be involved in homework and specifically spelling. that interesting? So someone's got to do it, ladies, apparently. That's for another day. Research now shows that there's consistent evidence that a father's interest and involvement in their children's learning is now statistically associated with better education outcomes. It's not just a nice thing to do. It actually has an impact on the outcomes of students' learning. Mums, I don't mean that means that it's not for you. That's just well understood. But the research now indicating about the role of dads in this work. And what I found really interesting, better exam results overall and more positive attitudes, and importantly in secondary as well as primary, because historically we see this kind of movement away from involvement when kids get into high school, largely because they don't want you there. I remember as I was reflecting on these comments, I was very fortunate to have the most wonderful upbringing. Neither of my parents went past about year 9 in terms of education, but there was something about this kind of deep understanding about the role of education in kids' lives. And I was having this joke with my dad. I said to him, I remember I was going to the year 9 disco and a couple of us girls decided we'd go footy themed, or I don't know why. But it wasn't long after the kind of, Olivia Newton-John silky, what were those things, leggings, and they were cut really tight and, kind of under the belly button, and then we cut the football jumpers up about as high as you could get. And my dad said, "You are not leaving this house." And, we had the teenage argument, and we talked about it, and on reflection, as parents, they were really clear, and they were prepared to say no. A lot of parents aren't prepared to say no, and I know how tough it is sometimes to say no. But that was just their general feeling. They set standards, they made decisions. My dad decided not to seek promotion because he would have had to have gone away. My mum decided not to work. Everyone makes their own decisions. They're not better than other decisions. They're just the ones they made. We didn't go out as a family on a Sunday night because we had to get ready for school. That sort of thing. Schooling and education, was central. And so now the research is, showing us again that it's, as I said, not just a good thing to do, but it makes a difference in the educational lives of children. But you and I know that work commitments for either parent is a key reason getting in the way of being involved in a child's life, and it's a very real, barrier. Childcare is another. For some, their own basic literacy and numeracy skills, or indeed their own poor experience at school. They're cited as difficulties in wanting or actually feeling able to support. Some people feel intimidated by teachers. So there's a range of reasons. And for those of you saying, yes, yep, I get it, but it's really hard. Life is busy, it's fast, it's full. Can I say to you, I totally agree. As a full-time working single parent, I know the struggle as well as you do about finding the space and time to get involved in school as well as that bit after school. But what I want to talk about are the other things that are in competition with just sitting down and spending time at home on positive learning experiences. And the more I kind of thought about this theme, and a couple of weekends ago, because I'm a bit of a nerd, starting to research some of the stuff behind this, I found it compelling. Technology, there is no doubt that today's youth are fully influenced by technology. There are some that aren't, but it's a generalisation, but most would seem to be. I had, about 6 19-year-old boys to dinner last night, which was, ambitious, to say the best. It was trying to feed them before they were going to the nightclub. Don't know if any of you have been down that road. But it wasn't prees, because I don't do that. But we're sitting around the table. I think one was talking and the rest were fiddling on their phone. It was a really interesting study of, how not to socialise. But they were socialising with everyone else, just not the people they were with. It's interesting. What's the effect of it? Access to media seems to accelerate the problem of children being aware of and seeking to emulate grown-up behaviour as well. They're taking their values from the media, the way some of them dress, their behaviour. Is that for me? No. Okay, sorry, I just heard a bell. Okay. I'll comply if it is. They're trying to emulate that grown-up behaviour, taking their values, their dress sense from teens on TV, internet and YouTube. And what I found fascinating about it is the teens on TV are usually about 24. Did you know that? Home and away, they're in school uniform. These kids, they drive cars, they're actually 24. They're not teenagers. The question we have to ask ourselves is 10 now the new 15? The media, for example, I think pushes girls to look, dress and act older than they are. Many little girls, the studies say, are feeling the pressure brought on by the media about the way they, from what they watch, about the way that they look, about the way they act as if they were older teenagers, pushing them to look, dress and act older. And look, perhaps this isn't the most appropriate topic to talk on a Sunday morning, but sex is everywhere. Have you noticed? Perhaps you shouldn't admit you haven't noticed. I don't know. Music videos. I go to the gym a lot, and you're hard-pressed to watch a music video these days that isn't highly sexualised. Movies, reality shows, beer ads. I came across in the video shop the other day, my son was buying a video game, a game where you can manipulate prostitutes and get them to do, and you can get it when you're 15, and I just, I'm not a wowser, so I don't say it for those reasons. But the sexual content that kids watch and listen to, promotes the idea of sexuality even at a much younger age. Interestingly, the Kaiser Family Foundation did a report and it showed that since 2008 there's been a jump in sexual content across the general media from 54% to 70%. That means our youth are getting exposed at a younger and younger age of sexual content, which leads to sexual stereotyping. And interesting research where preschool children, and it was a really interesting study, associate high-power adjectives with boys, such as being strong and fast and aggressive. And the adjectives that they chose that would match the girls: needs help, cries a lot, affectionate, that's okay, and being nice. So advertisements using gender role stereotyping. And for children who have not yet developed their identity, it can certainly be, confusing for them. If the child doesn't conform to the norm and they know it, then they feel something's wrong with them. Part of the problem that we have with, increased hurting and self-harm and depression and things like that. A little girl I interviewed said, "I want to be a doctor when I grow up, but I can't because I'm a girl, and girls are the nurses." And this wasn't in 1990, this was last year when we were doing some work on gender. And it makes me concerned, about the kind of mythology that goes around. She talked about if you're not good at maths, you don't become a doctor because doctors have to be good at maths and boys are good at maths. I get confronted with this all the time. Girls learn better in single-sex classes. When are we going to get over that? Some girls learn better in single-sex classes. Some girls don't. Some boys learn better in single-sex classes. Some boys don't. Because gender doesn't put a block around who you are. Not all girls are better at, the humanistic type subjects. Some are, some aren't. This thing about boys are better at maths and science. Look at the results. They're not. Each individual child, brings their own interests, strengths, weaknesses, values, etc. So I find it, really interesting. As technology advances, we rely more and more on it, understandably. Children are born into a technologically advanced world. There are positives and negatives about that. They will be prepared for a new world of work if they engage with technology. They must. Negatively, they're going to be evolved socially, sometimes in ways that you and I probably don't value as much. Technology is here to stay. It will keep advancing, and we must find ways to use and interact with it. It will have a huge impact on your children's lives. So we've got to find ways in which we can use it in the educational field so that they can compete in a global market. Let me say really clearly to you, my comments today are not a bash about technology. They're not a bash about the community or about the media and all of those things that go with it, or advertisements. I'll leave it to others, if that's how they feel, they can do that. I've said it publicly before, there is nothing inherently evil about Facebook or the internet or the media or any of those sorts of social technology that we have these days. It's what you do with it that can be so destructive, when we see cyberbullying and things like that. But that's not the reason why I'm raising it today. I raise it today because these things are very real competitors to the influence, the very good influence of family, friends, parents and caregivers. They're competitors to the partnership that we have between parents and teachers, between your work and that of my department. Because I'm trying to make the point today that the research says that your influence on the learning, growing and developing of your children starts before they come to us. You have the biggest role to play. The brain development work tells us that most of the brain is formed for academic disposition before they come to me. That's with you. And so we need to be in partnership, because there are really terrific learning opportunities in all that competition for space. It doesn't have to be a competition. So here's my point. It's a brave parent that stops their child from watching, Hannah Montana, or as I discovered with my niece the other night when I tried to turn off that horrible show called The Bachelor. But it's a thinking parent that can watch something like that and probably burn internally, as I was, and talk about the important things that arise in it. That's the thinking parent, rather than making some of these things competitions, using it for what teachers call the teachable moment. Talking about it as it arises, not later in the lecture, but about the values, the knowledge, the skills, the way the people were interacting, the way they showed respect to it, to the 15 people he's dating at once. I've got a bit of a thing happening here. Ways of learning, using different opportunities like that to talk about homophobic behaviour, to talk about racist behaviour, to talk about gender stereotypes, about talking about respect for people that have less than you. Using those opportunities. Because for me, it's what kids take from the experience that defines what is learnt. It's not necessarily the thing itself is good or bad, it's what they take from it. And unless you're in there shaping what they take from it, they might take something quite perverse. So I recommend parents and caregivers, as much as you can, to get in there and influence the learning that goes around in some of those things that we don't really even understand. After all, you're the most significant people in that job. And that's why the government and my department want to and keep looking into ways of helping parents with those years that happen before they even come into our early years program. And we recently announced KindyLink. The Minister might have mentioned it. Three-year-old kindergarten for Aboriginal students, where we're also going to work with the parents. Another attempt to try and influence and help and support, because it's a tough job. As a parent, I know it's a tough job. As a teacher, I know that's a tough job. And so it's bringing together the tough jobs and using the power of the combination, the power of the partnership, before they even come deeply into the school system. So look, in conclusion, it's a challenge. The challenge is for you and me and grandparents and caregivers and friends, all of the most important people in a child's life. What can they bring into the life of the child? What can we speak, into the life of the child? What influence do we bring? How can you pour something into a kid's learning at that critical stage that helps them be resilient, to be able to be discerning about all of those other competitive influences that are going to come into their life? so that they learn to ask questions of it and not just assume all that stuff that comes to them is true. If I have to read another assignment or essay, based on YouTube or, similar things where there is no moderation of truth or fact. So our kids are bombarded with that information that they sometimes just accept. How do we teach them to be discerning of that? And how do we help parents at that important, particularly the important early years? Let's think about how to get fathers more involved in quality time and supporting them, juggling their lives. Let's think about how to help working mums. Let's think about those mums at home that juggle multiple intelligences and tasks and skills and other kids. Let's think about the partnership and strengthening that between the parents and the school, between the parents and the child's teacher. And what I want to say to you today is what you do is front and centre. What this organisation does is help me and my people bridge that gap. You are front and centre. You are leaders in this work. And I think a question comes up later about, are we just a fundraising body? Well, if you are, I think that really limits your capacity and the influence you have. But I'm ever thankful for your commitment and your passion and your efforts in helping us bridge this gap, support parents, support teachers, as we all are key in children's lives. And one thing I know from personal experience is parents and broader parenting people have a tough job. We've got to all be in it together, and so I thank you for your commitment. Thanks again, WACSSO representatives.
Thank you very much, Sharyn. So we will now proceed to the questions that were provided on notice to the Director-General. As with the questions to the Minister yesterday, they will appear on the board and everyone can read, so I will just introduce them. The first question is from Albany Primary School to do with IPS.
Oh, sorry, I thought... no one's actually going to read it to me? Okay, good. Okay. I think that's a great development because people used to read them and I used to be reading it at the same time, so good. It comes from Michelle. Look, thanks for the question. Is there an expected date? No. There's never been an expectation that all schools would be IPS. The government laid out a choice for schools to put their hand up and to be selected, and my understanding is that the government remains committed to the choice agenda. So it's about choice. And the government, if they decide to have another round and asking people to put their hand up, then they will make that known. But schools put their hand up and then there's a selection process. So people aren't going to be forced. There's no expected date for transition. Choice, the government policy at this stage is that choice remains.
Thank you. The next question is from Esperance Senior High School to do with curriculum.
Yeah, curriculum catering for underachievers. Well, it's school by school. The curriculum doesn't cater really in some ways for people. Teachers cater for people. And so teachers are asked and required to what we call differentiate. So that is understand the strengths and weaknesses of each child and work to those strengths and weaknesses in the framework or the outline that we have in Western Australia for curriculum. The second part of the question is really interesting, and I think you might have Alan Blagage coming soon. Oh, and there he is, he's waving at the back. My colleague Alan, and he, I don't know if he'll attend to some of this as well, but considering the push for ulnar achievement, I've specifically said to schools last year that I don't want them to wait till ulnar and, oh goodness, we've got someone that's struggling. That shouldn't be the case, and as parents it shouldn't be a surprise to you if your child is struggling and going to struggle around ulnar. I would expect you would know sometime before that. And so my expectation is, and I've said to schools, you need to identify students who you anticipate will struggle with this test and be intervening very early. And so I would recommend to parents that they're clear about whether the school has a view about the performance of their child around ulnar achievement. But ulnar represents, good good solid achievement, and we want all children to be able to be successful on that test.
The next question is about Geograph Primary and the topic that you just alluded to a few seconds ago about P&Cs only being fundraising bodies, or largely, my apologies, largely.
So, from Lisa. I think I've probably given my views around this. We're very appreciative of the fundraising efforts, and I know how hard it is to whip people into a frenzy about fundraising. And so I really acknowledge the work that's done with this. But I think the role is, in most places, much broader than this, but it's probably a bit unrecognised about the role P&Cs can play in, bringing together the views of parents and talking to the school council about emerging issues and making some parents feel comfortable when they're new into the school. So I see it as a much... the role of the P&C is what you make it. I can't tell you what to be. But the opportunity and the goodness that can come from a broader view of P&Cs, but they're not the council, it's a different role, it is certainly terrific in the life of a school.
Thank you, Sharyn. The next question from Carol Barry District High School about principals being given autonomy within their own school.
Okay, first part of the question, why are principals given so much autonomy? Well, because the Act has always allowed the principal a fair degree of autonomy, because under the School Education Act, they are what you might call the site manager or the end-of-line person for that school. They're the one, they are singularly the person that is held accountable at the end of the day for what happens at that school. And so it makes sense that they have a fair degree of autonomy in how that might roll out. Now, why has it been more of an issue of late? Well, let me tell you this. Since having been here now for a long time, we've tried very big centralised programs where we've said, this is what you have to do, whether you're in Kellabarron or Kalbarri or Kununurra, everyone's doing the same thing and it's all good for you. And we've got a lot of pushback actually from parents saying, well, actually our community is a bit different to that one. And besides that, the results weren't great. So I think what we've learnt over time is that we need schools and their communities to customise to the kids that they serve, to the community they serve. Now, why are they given so much autonomy? Well, they're given autonomy within system parameters. They are not autonomous, and I've always been a little bit uncomfortable with the term because public schools are not autonomous. They are public schools and they have to fall within the framework or the responsibilities of being public schools, and that's something that we should be very proud of. If you don't want to be one of those, then you become a private, well, you don't just become a private school, but that's the distinction. We are part of a system, and I remind our IPS people about that. Now, what should a P&C do if they receive numerous complaints from teachers and parents about a principal? Well, my recommendation to you is that if you've got a complaint about someone, you should go and tell them. But I'm a reasonably direct person. I think there's nothing worse than the playground or car park chatter. I think it's destructive. And I don't think gets you anywhere, and sometimes takes something that could be resolved pretty easily, well, not easily, but reasonably, and makes it something that's not. So if someone's got a complaint about me, I'd rather they tell me, and usually I find out pretty quickly, and I think everyone should have the same respect. I think it should be done respectfully. Our teachers and principals are trying to do their very best, and if there's something you don't agree with, I just think you just go and have a conversation, don't you? They're human beings like everyone else. I would take with you, if you were having that conversation, if you've got some evidence or background, so it's not just I heard 3 people said, which is not helpful. So I'd go through, look, my advice is go directly to the principal. If you're not comfortable with that, go through the school council. And everyone should have an inspiring leader taking their children. That's our expectation. Where that's not working, we do intervene and have requirements for people to reconsider their performance and help them to improve. But the first port of call is just talk to them about the issue. There might be, 3 sides to the story. There usually is.
Thanks, Sharyn. I think that's very true. The next question from Maylands Peninsula Primary School about high density populations in the inner city areas.
Yeah, really interesting now in Perth. We're seeing that growth in the inner city and western suburbs area. You would have seen it where the old big block's been divided and you've got two houses on the one old block. Well, what that means for us is sometimes in areas we've got twice as many, or not quite twice as many, but a lot more kids coming in. And obviously this question from Erin, goes to the heart of that at Maylands Peninsula. So the last bit of the question is, what are you going to do about it? Which is a good question. And there are some things that we can do, and not all of them are straightforward. First of all, what we have to do is look at who's going to the school. If I wind back, originally when schools had space, and this remains their policy today, if they had space so that they weren't all full in their classrooms, the principal was allowed to consider people who were from out of boundary and consider them to come in if they had space. Now, what's happened in some inner city schools that had a lot of space, because when we had the urban sprawl, everyone kind of moved out to the new suburbs. When they had space, they took a whole bunch of people from out of boundary. Now, we're looking at that. And in some places, we've said to those communities, you can't take any more out of boundary because you've got to serve your own local intake area. The people who are in there already can't be shuffled off, so don't get nervous about that. But we have said now you need to exercise the rules that have existed for a long time, and perhaps stop taking people from out of boundary. So that's one thing that we look at. This is not what we're going to do. We do this right now. We need to consider sometimes the local intake areas where the boundaries are drawn. As you can imagine, that's a very contentious issue, because some people in our, what I'd call preferred areas, actually buy properties so that they can ensure they're inside the local intake area, and we don't want people to be disadvantaged. Sometimes schools run for my department a program like PIAC or like a Gifted and Talented that brings people from the outside, so we could consider relocating some of those programs. As you've seen, we do have a fleet of transportables. In my day when I was teaching, it was a curse to get the transportable out the back. But these days, I was just at Churchlands recently, a number of the teachers want to teach in them. They're brand new, they're different to what they were in the old days, and they're air-conditioned, so people like that. Or we can build permanent classrooms. And then, of course, we need to look at whether we need brand new settings. So there's a range of things that we do and can contemplate. It's normally not just one resolution. Multi-storey schools, for example, wouldn't be entirely off the agenda. It's usually a combination of these things that we need to look at, and the one that you've probably heard most about of recent times is western suburbs, out kind of city beach way, where we, by about 2026 we'll have 4,000 more students in that area, and the schools are already squeezed. So to Erin's question, which was about Maylands Peninsula, I've broadened it for the purpose of the discussion, but there are a range of things that we can do. I can't make particular mention about Maylands Peninsula specifically, but a range, combinations of some of those things that I've raised are usually the way that we would approach the problem.
A very complex issue, I'm sure. Thank you, Sharyn. Thank you. The next question's from Naranda Primary School about School of Special Needs Education.
So I was trying to kind of understand really what's at the heart of this, but we have a school, for people who don't know, called, that bit at the top, School of Special Needs Education. Basically, it's a visiting teacher service that runs out of Padbury and goes out to schools. And I think what was intended by the question is school psychs, we have an allocation. Each school gets a bit of a school psych. If you're a big school, you might get a full-time one. If you're a small school, you might get a day or a couple of days. And I think the question is, rather than have wait lists for things like therapy focus, why don't we give those allocations? Well, this asks about non-education department staff. I can't control non-education department staff. But if the question is more about, for example, speech therapy or occupational therapy or some of the services that we run, at the moment it's on a needs basis. So there's not much point giving everyone a portion of a service if in fact there's no need at that school. But it's a limited resource. And so at the moment we believe the way that we orchestrate that is the best use of that resource. But obviously if we had a lot more, we could provide more service out to schools. So we are a bit limited by what we can afford, and then we supplement it by people, for example, as mentioned here, therapy focus, non-education department staff.
Thank you. The next question from Port Hedland Primary School to do with principal performance.
What is the policy on managing principals in an underperforming school? Well, interesting. We could spend a whole day on this because, what is an underperforming school, and, is it the principal, at the heart of that? Is there any accountability? So I'll start with the last part first. Yes, there's very strong accountability. Even stronger now with IPS, who have an agreement. If you're in an IPS school, there's a written agreement between the principal, myself directly, and the school board chair about the expectation about what has to be delivered. So is there any accountability? Yes. I think probably the next question that perhaps, Lynn, you should have asked is there any consequence, which is probably what you meant by the word accountability, and the answer is yes. So the first part of the question, what is the department's policy? There's actually whole of government policy on what's called substandard performance, and before that, performance management. So every principal has performance management. What are the expectations? How are they going against that? And for the most part, everyone's performing very well. From time to time, you have a principal who's perhaps struggling in some dimensions, and at some point, the department, myself specifically, has to make a judgment about whether that person is underperforming. And there's a government process that has to be gone through to, I guess, test that assumption. But this question is interesting because there are two parts to it: a principal and an underperforming school. So you can have a very good principal at a school who, depends what measure you're looking at, is underperforming. For example, we have some schools where the results of the kids are really great cause for concern, very often in low SES areas, or sometimes in other higher perhaps SES areas where they look like they're coasting. So it's possible to have a fantastic principal and a school whose results are struggling. So that's why I'm kind of trying to answer it two different ways. But usually what we see with a fantastic principal in a school where the results aren't great is that the results are improving. And that's our focus, school improvement. What people are held accountable for is the improvement that we want to see over time, so that we have every school performing to the level that we would want it to. But I think I've said a couple of years ago, we can line up, unfortunately, and it's my greatest heart probably burden, that you can line up schools in accordance with their SES. Basically, they're from poverty to, rich, I suppose, to put it bluntly, and you can almost map kids' performance against that. That's how close the relationship, the correlation is between performance and social, financial background. And that's the thing that keeps me in public schooling, because that burns me deeply. Depending on what circumstance you were born into, can have such a profound impact on your learning outcomes. And that's what public schools are here to change that balance, so everyone gets a good deal. So that's why I make this point. You can't say the results are very, very, very bad in this school or not so great in this school. It's the principal's fault. That's too simplistic. But what we hold them accountable for is having a plan for improvement. And in my time as Director General, I've seen some schools whose results were very poor turn around, and it turns around on the basis of the hard work of the teachers, the hard work of the support staff, the hard work of the parents, and the leadership of the principal. And that's what we hold them accountable for.
Thank you very much. The next question from Secret Harbour Primary School is to do with difficulties in attracting funding for shade at their school. And
this must be the longest question of all time, Emma. But really it's how do you get some shade over difficult areas or areas, and obviously a great job has been done to fundraise. Look, it's an area of quite some detail that I can only give you probably a high-level answer to, but Emma, is Emma in the audience? Emma, it might be better if you drop me an email and I'll see if I can help you specifically find the way through and give you the best advice to where to go. But just for the purposes of everyone, the government gave us $5 million over 4 years for this kind of material and equipment, and schools have been invited to apply for funding of up to $20,000 to contribute towards it. It doesn't pay for the lot because those of you that have done this sort of stuff know it's pretty expensive. So far we've had 327 schools who have benefited, and the final round, so get in, will be made available for schools in early 2016. Now I don't know why Secret Harbour hasn't been the beneficiary of that, but perhaps, Emma, if you get from Kylie my email address, we'll forward it on to the people who are dealing with it and see if you're in the mix or if you haven't applied or whatever else it is. But I don't want 500 emails, everyone. Just to be honest.
Okay, thank you, Sharyn. Our final question is from the Pilbara area to do with IPS and staffing, essentially.
Okay, yes, for people who aren't across the detail of this, we used to have quite a strong transfer points system. If you were somewhere for this amount of time, you accrued this many points and you could use your points to go, move somewhere else. With the advent of IPS, and in fact, even before IPS, but more particularly IPS, the way of moving around the system is to be selected, essentially. So you're in this case, let's say you're if you're in the Pilbara, I don't know, I taught in Marble Bar. When I taught in Marble Bar, you'd accrue a certain amount of points and you'd use those points to get back if you wanted to come back to the city. Or go somewhere else, in fact, go to Kalbarri or Albany or something. Now the school advertises the job they have and you apply to go there. So it's a change in system where you don't just have people who rock up by virtue of lots of points. It's now a situation where the principal and others select people coming into their school. So why do we move to that? Well, we moved to that because we wanted people to be in schools where they wanted to be there. It's an important thing. It helps if you want to be in a place. Secondly, we wanted to make sure that we could get the very best combination of skills into a particular school. So you wanted someone that had, the principal needs someone who has a particular maths background. I mean, all teachers obviously are qualified to teach everything in primary and learning areas in secondary. But it was about getting the mix of people into the school so that they had, not the same competencies and skills and passions, but a mix of those things. And that the school felt that they were choosing the best people who wanted to go there. That's the reason for it. I think they're very good reasons to move to the system. What's the department looking to attract, retain quality teachers and administrators out in country schools? Well, there's a range of things that we do. Sometimes I'm asked the other side of the question was how can we ensure that people can get back to the city? Because there was this great kind of hoo-ha about with IPS no one allowed to be able to get home. Well, the fact is more people over the past 3 years have moved from the country to the city than they did previously. More flexibility. So that kind of myth I think we can put aside. But this is a really good question because you might remember, I remember it, it's burned in my memory, we had 264 teachers short on day one. I'll never forget, and neither will people in schools, what that was like. So we've done a lot of things since then and we continue to do. There is still a transfer pool. That's still in place and people move through that process. As I said, we have merit selection. Teachers who work in the country teaching program receive allowances up to around $18,000 extra a year in recognition of the extra cost And they also receive their permanency after 2 years of service. So there are benefits to going to the country. If you're in a remote community school, you can get up to nearly $26,000 extra per year. They get free housing, free relocation, and they get, and you'll love this, an additional 10 weeks paid leave if they stay in that place for 3 years. Would anyone like that? It's a good deal. We don't have a problem staffing our remote community schools. I'd love 10 weeks after 3 years. But I've been in those places. They deserve it. They do damn good work out there, I must say. Every penny of that is well deserved. We have practicums where pre-service teachers, I always reckon part of the reason why people won't go is because they don't know about a place. I love it when we have people from overseas say, Wingalina sounds mystical and interesting, and I'm saying, don't show them the map, They think there's palm trees, don't tell them, No, we don't really. We do overseas recruiting if we have to, and we don't do it if we don't. Pilbara cities and various things there. But some of the most important ones have been recently our switch program, where we retrained secondary people to teach in other secondary areas. We retrained primary teachers to teach in secondary. That was a really great renewal opportunity, and some people went to the country to avail themselves of that opportunity. And we've got training schools. So look, we've got lots going on to attract. We've had for the past 4 years 100% day one staffing. And so that's been fantastic in the difficult time that we've had to get teacher numbers up, particularly last year. We tend to retain more than we did before, particularly our young people. But let me tell you this, when I was a teacher, and the people that you would know, you had to go to the country. That was how it worked. You had to go. And people understood that. Now people can apply. Graduates can apply to go to the country. We had 2 people last year, 2 people who said they would go anywhere in the state. So this is not only about what the Education Department can do, it's also about the change in the way young people in particular view work. Lots of them want to stay in the city because they actually don't want to work full time. Their social connections are very strong. We have a lot of working mums and dads that need to stay closer to family networks and support. So the demographics is different. The view of working is different. And this idea of permanence that used to be a very strong government policy and remains. I'm not suggesting it doesn't remain. But young people don't particularly value permanence because they don't intend to stay. A lot of them want to work for 2 years and go and travel. So I think we've got to kind of see this through the lens and the eyes of young people, not just, I turned 50 this year. I've been doing this for, teacher since I was, however old I was, 21 or something. And what it was like then, it's very different now. We valued permanence. We wanted to be, teacher, same school. Some people have been at the same school for 30 years. It's just different now. So we have to be contemporary. We have to view it differently. We have to be more flexible in work arrangements. But at the end of the day, we want the very best people in our schools, and that's what we're trying to do.